the Moses we find here in the wilderness is not the Hollywood blockbuster version of Moses or the Michelangelo statue version of Moses. You know, the heroic figure of advanced age with a somber, noble expression and long flowing hair. This is often the image we conjure up when we think of Moses. No, the Moses we find here in the wilderness is a young man, a refugee, a foreigner, a sheep herder, an outlaw. The Moses we find here is a survivor of trauma, an adopted son who sat uneasy with his royal identity, a murderer, a fugitive from justice. Hardly a more dramatic life story can be imagined. And this story here in the wilderness, after all that drama, is still just the beginning of his tumultuous life. Moses can certainly be excused for thinking that he had had quite enough tragedy and danger in his life and did not want anything to do with saving his people from slavery. In the very first verse of our reading, we are told that Moses led his flock beyond the wilderness. The first listeners of this story, thousands of years ago, would have felt the hair on the back of their necks stand up when they heard that phrase, beyond the wilderness. It is an ominous phrase that we mostly pass by as we read. But wilderness in the Old Testament, it is mentioned more than 300 times. Wilderness indicates danger, foreboding, dread. In the wilderness are animals that lurk and attack. Hunger and thirst are a constant threat. These are unpopulated, untracked, unsafe areas. And Moses was not only in the wilderness, he was beyond the wilderness. The wild animals there might be even hungrier, even more ferocious. Moses was keeping his father-in-law's sheep, which sounds tame enough, but he was in very dangerous territory. He was beyond the wilderness. 3 words in English, just 2 words in Hebrew, and we know that we are in a very scary place. Being in a very scary place is not at all hard for us to imagine in these days of pandemic and protest. Like Moses, we are beyond the wilderness in this year of fear and anxiety. Many, many of us have lost loved ones and colleagues to the deadly disease called COVID-19. We are beyond the wilderness in these days of encountering the insidious power and perversion of racism. We are beyond the wilderness in unemployment numbers in our communities and global unrest that inevitably hits women and children and the poor harder and deeper. We are beyond the wilderness. And so this is a story for all of us now. It reveals to us 2 things about God that we need to hear now. First, there is no wilderness so wild that God cannot find us there. This is a scary place, but God is there. In fact, God is there waiting for Moses. God shows up first and puts flame to a scrubby bush. Moses shows up second. The bush is already on fire, but it does not burn down. It displays and inexhaustible divine energy, perpetually aflame, this bush. So not only does God show up beyond the wilderness, God was there first and revealed holy divine presence in this most unlikely place. Is this something we need to hear on this day in this time of fire and grief and anger? God is already there. God is right now revealing holy divine presence in any of the unlikely places in our lives. Our places of pain, our places of loneliness and longing, our places of intense anger, our places of exhaustion, our places of depression and hollow emptiness. God is already there. The second thing that this story reveals to us about God is that God is not deterred by our shortcomings and failures. Moses has an arm's length list of reasons and excuses and loopholes as to why he is not the one to do this hard thing, to follow this call of God. Oh no, this is a case of mistaken identity. God, I think you mean to call someone who is strong and brave and smart and connected to power brokers who can swing a deal for you, God, not me. I'm a fugitive, a refugee, an immigrant, a marked man. No, God, not me. God is not deterred by our shortcomings and failures. God calls Moses in spite of his checkered past. God calls David even though he was just a boy. God calls Esther even though she was just a harem girl. God calls Mary even though she was on the bottom rung of society. God calls you even though you don't feel wise enough for ministry in this complicated and painful world. If God calls Moses in spite of everything, I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised if God calls us too. God is not deterred by our shortcomings and failures. This story not only reveals those two things about God, but also something about Moses and about us too. And that is that the people God calls, flawed people like Moses and like me and like you, are burdened with doubts and indecision. We, and by we I mean Moses and us, we lie awake at night wondering whether we are doing the right thing. We procrastinate, obfuscate, deliberate, and frustrate the clear call of God. We drag our feet. It's true, we do. But God persists and promises, I will be with you. And a few verses later in this same chapter, God even reveals a new and mysterious divine name. I am who I am. Or maybe I will be who I will be. Or even in the suggestion of one biblical commentator, whenever God is being God, God will be the kind of God God is. No matter what the translation, it is a name that signals promise. This story invites us to lean hard into that promise. In these days of dark discouragement, God's promise is a light breaking in from on high. Thanks be to God for God's inexhaustible, never-ending, always present love. Amen.